introductions and opening part, and then we'll move to actual session and discussion. So my name is Mahmoud Katsareteli. I'm the head of America-Georgia Business Council. Business Council planned its annual conference, 23rd one, for March 18th, but because of obvious reasons, we had to postpone that event. And we decided several weeks ago that this year we'll go through several online webinars in May and June as a part of this conference, annual conference. And maybe if health conditions and pandemic allows, we'll do one event, in-person event, maybe just reception later in the year. I also wanted to remind some of our members and friends of the America-Georgia Business Council that we'll host our traditional now third annual wine forum. This year it will be organized in collaboration with the University of California in Davis. And there will be activities in Davis and San Francisco if again pandemic allows us to do that. So today we have excellent set of speakers. I think best of the best, I should say, and having the subject in mind. And our subject today is to talk about internal and external dynamics of Georgian economy and how Georgia responds to pandemic and COVID-19. So our speakers include Mercedes Vera Martin. She is a Deputy Division Chief at International Monetary Fund with great experience working in different parts of the world. And she worked on Georgia already several years. And she understands Georgia very well. So that's an excellent opportunity to have her with us today. And IMF, as you all know, just recently approved new program for Georgia, actually addition to existing program. So Mercedes will share with us all the details of that. Our next speaker will be Otar Sharikadze, who is the CEO of Galton Taggart. And this investment bank, many of you know, was one of the first to publish assessment of impact of COVID-19 on Georgia in March. It was very helpful and useful document. And Otar will give us some update on his views on and the bank's views on economic development and expectations that investors may have about Georgia. And last but not least, our good friend Anthony Kim from Heritage Foundation and editor of Index of Economic Freedom, who will look at Georgia from a broader perspective, Georgia's place in world and economy and the interactions with the other countries and where Georgia stands in terms of rankings and so forth. So one thing I just wanted to mention from the beginning is that you will be able to ask questions to our speakers, but you need to use chat function and send us message with the question, and then we can try to ask questions to the speakers and answer to your question. And one final point I would like to mention is that these are obviously uncertain times, and we may predict things and we may calculate different things and different models, but this pandemic and this virus is very something that we've never experienced before, at least in our lifetime. And our lifetimes, and that's why uncertainty will be accompanying us going forward for rest of this year and maybe in the next year. So I think obviously we are trying to understand impact of the virus and everything that is happening on the economy of Georgia and the global economy. We may again look at different models, but a lot of things will be unknown and will remain unknown. But our job is really to assess potential impact points and try to address those challenges that will occur. Now I would like to ask Mercedes to start her presentation, and if you could post the PowerPoint, please. By the way, it's first time we are doing webinar, so it's actually we are.
Don't be hard on us.
Yeah. Yes. Very good. Thank you very much, Mamuka, for the invitation to the annual conference of the Business Council. It's a pleasure to be here. As you mentioned before, these are unprecedented times. It called for unprecedented thinking also. And I think in that sense, it's going to be very challenging to think about how the new normal will be in the future. So if I could move to the next slide, I would like to start with some stylized facts pre-COVID pandemic, just to give you a flavor a little bit about how we saw the economy before the shock. So as you all know, Georgia is a small open economy with low value production base. However, in the last years, it has been benefiting significantly from a strong growth in export, tourism sector and remittances that led to a significant narrowing of the current account deficit, one of the vulnerabilities that the economy was facing. We have seen also resilient economic growth, and that has resulted in a significant decline in poverty reduction. By regional standards, you all know Georgia ranks strongly in terms of governance, with one of the easiest doing business indicators and also a good control of corruption. Georgia has attracted foreign investors in past years, especially in the energy and the logistics sector. And policies and reform has been directed to reduce the structural bottlenecks, especially in infrastructure and more recently on skills. If we can move to the next slide, please. In terms of strength ahead of the shock, one has to highlight that Georgia has a good track record of macroeconomic policy discipline. We engaged with Georgia in a new program in April 2017 that has a very good track record. It has been on time. Authorities have been committed to fiscal discipline, to a stable macroeconomic environment, and they have been advancing in structural reforms. They also have the economy in itself has a well-capitalized banking sector. Both banking regulation and supervision has been strengthened in the last years, and the authorities continue to be committed to advancing reforms in the banking sector resolution framework. They were able also to build fiscal buffers. They have done fiscal consolidation in the last years. They have shifted from current spending to investment in order to address the infrastructure gap. And we have seen an improvement also in the sources of financing by deepening the local domestic capital market. And as you all know, Georgia benefits from a strong donor engagement and support, and we will discuss this a little bit later in the context of the shock. So if we could move to the next slide. So how does the shock impact the Georgian economy? So first we need to start with by highlighting that the authorities have taken very stringent containment measures. The state of emergency was implemented in March 20th. They have been curfews. They have limited the mobility of people in the country, and we understand that the state of emergency will finish by the end of this week. But with the lockdown, it has a significant impact on economic activity. So Georgia, that benefited in the past from significant sources of revenues from tourism, we see tourism that has stopped. This is hurting the hospitality sector and the service sector. There has been also, as you can imagine, a slowdown in remittances because of the measures that have been taken also in other countries, and migrants being affected by those measures. Initially, we saw the lari depreciating significantly more than its peers by about 20%, but now it has recovered lately. It remains relatively stable, and it has, from the beginning of the year to now, it has depreciated by about 10% year on year. The central bank sold foreign exchange to prevent excessive volatility, taking into account that we have an economy that is highly dollarized. Non-residents invested in domestic government securities, especially by the end of 2019, beginning of 2020, with the increase in policy rates that we saw at the end of the year. Those non-residents actually have sold, and that led to capital outflows. And then facing liquidity pressures, the MBG has started to implement FX swaps lines with the banks and the microfinance institutions to secure liquidity in the system, both in FX and in lari. One has to say that the initial policy response to limit the impact of the shock has been timely, proactive, and consistent with the IMF advice. It has been targeted, and all the measures that have been discussed with us have a temporary nature. Could we please move to the next slide? So how do we see the outlook? So given the dependence of Georgia on tourism sector and on external demand, we see a pronounced economic slowdown for this year. And we are projecting GDP to decline by 4% in 2020. It will recover in 2021 by 4%, but as you can all imagine, these projections are subject to more than the usual uncertainty. So in this table, we have summarized the main indicators of our assumptions about the balance of payments shock. We foresee significant negative growth in the second quarter and third quarter of this year, with some recovery in growth in the fourth quarter. And the magnitude of the shock that we are foreseeing or we are projecting is significantly much larger than the one we saw in 2014. We have identified a balance of payment gap of 1.8 billion in 2020-2021. About 3/4 of that gap is in 2020, and we are projecting to close that gap with IMF and donor financing. The gap is rising from a widening of the current account deficit to 11.5% of GDP, and we see a deterioration in the financial account of 5% of GDP. Risk, as you can all imagine, are on the downside because of the uncertainty about the duration and intensity of the shock. A more protracted shock could weaken aggregate demand for longer, increase the BOP needs and the fiscal deficit, and worsen bank asset quality and liquidity conditions, and that could weaken even further the subsequent recovery that we are projecting. A more protracted outbreak and growth slowdown will require definitely additional fiscal response and a more accommodative monetary policy, while market pressures will need to be dealing a combination of exchange rate flexibility and the use of reserves. The authorities, I have to say, the authorities have been able to mobilize significant donor assistance that allows them to sustain external buffers and to build fiscal buffers that will allow for additional policy response if the downside risks materialize. If we can move to the next slides. So let me talk briefly about how we are seeing the policy response. And it's a combination of different pillars. So we support the authorities' line of defense first with the exchange rate flexibility to defend and to absorb the shock in the context of a small open economy. This is combined with intervention in the foreign exchange market to safeguard financial stability, given that the system is dollarized. And of course, exchange rate depreciation impacts the balance sheet of households and borrowers in terms of a higher debt service, but also has the impact on inflation. And inflation has been more persistent than we have initially envisaged because of the additional depreciation. We think that maintaining a tight monetary policy seems adequate at this moment, and we are projecting reaching the target by the inflation target of 3% by the end of 2021. The authorities have been proactively putting a discretionary fiscal stimulus package that have been discussed with us. This amounts to 4% of GDP. 3 percentage points of GDP is directed to support households in different forms, either because they have lost their jobs. There is also support for the most vulnerable. There is also support to informal workers here. And there is also support to business that retain workers. There is also support to the business in the form of extending credit guarantees to sustain access to credit for the business. And the authorities are also putting an additional package to support some sectors more specifically. In terms of the financial situation, we see that the financial system at the moment has sufficient buffers that have been released. They can be utilized in terms of liquidity and capital requirements, and we see the system relatively strong at this moment. Sustaining the international financing support has been very important, and I have to say that in our discussions that we have in April with the authorities and also with the donors, Georgia remains in a privileged situation and has been able to mobilize borrowing for about 14% of GDP. This will help to finance a deficit that we are targeting at 8.5% of GDP and build additional fiscal buffers of 6% of GDP that the authorities could utilize if the shock is impact on the economy is stronger or last for longer than what we are thinking. The authorities remain committed to the structural reforms. They are advancing with the reforms that we envisage under the program. They are progressing with the insolvency framework at the moment that will help probably sustain a more rapid recovery in the future. The resolution framework on the banking sector, that has been in the program since we started in 2017. They are advancing with the implementation. The reform was approved at the end of 2019. And they are also working or advancing with the education reform. If I can move to the next slide. In terms of the engagement with us, so we just approved the fifth review under the EFF arrangement that increased financial assistance from us to Georgia by 130% of the quota. The original program was 100% of quota, so we more than double the financing assistance for a total of about 375 million. The program expires in April 2021. The authorities have indicated the interest to sustain program engagement with us, and the most peculiar thing for this review is that the disbursement of financial assistance during this review has not been to the central bank to build reserves, but for budget support. So it has been directly transferred to the Ministry of Finance to help the authorities meet urgent medical and social economic needs, and also to help them excuse me, transition. There is a significant amount of donor financing that is coming this year, but this is mostly backloaded for the end of the year. So our budget support will help also bridge financing needs during the year. The authorities are pursuing appropriate policies to combat the crisis and remain committed to advance with the reforms that we have originally envisaged under the program. And the authorities, as I mentioned before, have secured significant donor assistance that will help them build buffers beyond the financing gap that they are facing at the moment. With that, I have to say all the details that of the negotiation that we have been already published in the IMF. You can find the link here. All the authorities report and the more details about the fiscal package are in our documents, and I'm available if you want to reach me. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mamuka. Back to you.
Thank you, Mercedes. Thank you. Obviously, very interesting presentation and very interesting details. I would like to now turn to Otar to give us maybe more kind of detailed view on several key sectors of Georgian economy and where he sees things moving forward and progressing or regressing.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Mamuka, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be always at the Council's meetings. It's been my third or fourth time I'm participating here, so always happy to be part of this. Let me share my screen for a second and we can start. My presentation is, I touch base on certain impacts that the government is, that the COVID-19 has on the country, but also how we see how Georgia should behave in the coming month in order to overcome faster and maybe even gain some competitiveness in the future. So I'll talk about the existing, as I mentioned, the economic structure and the impact of COVID on Georgia. We'll discuss some sectors where Georgia has a production capacity and where we see this potential. And I think we'll also touch base on the roadmap that we think Georgia should implement in order to attract the FDI in the coming months. As you can see, historically, Georgia has always been a service-oriented country. Basically, if you look at the share in GDP of services, it accounts almost to 80% of our GDP. And the proof of that is tourism has been the driving locomotive of economy for the last years. Actually, the tourism sector only represents around 20% of the GDP. So this high dependence on services means that we are very dependent on imports. And we have very low goods export base in Georgia. And if you look at the slide on the chart on the right-hand side, you can see if you take the exports and exclude all products which are for re-export and imports for local demand, you see that export is only 12%. And it has been so low for years now. So this is nothing new for Georgian economy, unfortunately. We have never been able to increase this indicator at a sustainable level. On the other hand, if you look at the import figures, it represents around 45% of the GDP, which is quite significant thing if you consider the fact also that Georgia is heavily dollarized, and when you have the currency fluctuation, it becomes much more difficult for the country. As for the impact on the economy, I think Mrs. Martin in detail discussed this, but overall we believe that the hit will be in around $3.6 billion, which is a very significant number for Georgia. The biggest shock will be on tourism sector, obviously. We believe that we'll lose around $2.2 billion from tourism industry. For comparison reasons, in 2019, this figure represented 3.3 million. And according to our predictions pre-COVID pandemics, we thought that this figure was supposed to be around 3.7 billion. So this is a very significant shock for the country. On the other side, if we look at the items of how to compensate these losses, the major part of the adjustments will be on the import side, I think. We believe that imports will reduce by around $2.1 billion, and this reduction will be driven from two sides. One of them is obviously demand collapse. So there is a huge contraction of demand, not only in Georgia, but overall in the world. But on the other side, there is a huge fall on the oil prices. And Georgia, as you know, is a very big importer of oil products. Additionally, we see certain economies down by Georgians who will not, unfortunately, be able to travel abroad. So we'll see certain economies on that side, around $400 million. As Ms. Martin mentioned already, National Bank of Georgia has already started intervening on the market in order to support the local currency. And we predict that throughout the year, this amount will reach around $300 million. Overall, in order to fill in the gap, we'll need additional external borrowing of $1 billion. But as Ms. Martin already mentioned, Georgia has done an extensive job on this, and with the support of the donor organizations, we've managed to accumulate funds which are much more than 1 billion. So I think we even might have some kind of buffers if the situation were to worsen. If we look at the more detailed view, we see certain levels of certain, let's say, stages or waves of impact on Georgian economy. Obviously, the immediate effect is still around the tourism industry and businesses surrounding it, such as hotels, restaurants, shopping centers, entertainment, and transport. All these industries have been closed through for last 3 months, and we are just seeing that from June we're gonna see some hotels open up for internal hotel tourism, and then we're gonna open up for the foreign tourists from July, and we might even see some shopping malls opening up from next week even. So this is a brand new news which I saw on the today. So this is a positive view for this industry, but still they've been hit quite hard. Another delayed negative effect is still on the financial sector, construction, real estate rates. So overall, all sectors have been hit quite negatively. But there is still a kind of a sector, a certain area of industries which have been, I would say, impacted less or have even a slightly positive effect, which is healthcare, pharmacy, e-commerce have been growing quite well in Georgia, certain parts of agriculture, communication, and obviously local tourism, which I think will be most actively used this year rather than traveling abroad. All this being said, actually, and all the analysis have been done about the impact on Georgia, we understand that this is an unprecedented period of time where the volatility is very high. Basically, it's very hard to say any prognostic and stand behind that. So everything could move in a positive way or negative way, but we still try to ask the following question, whether this crisis could present certain new possibilities for Georgia. And basically, should we continue we're living with the existing economic growth model, or maybe try to enhance production capacity and diversify further. So at Galton Taggart, we've been working on this research where we try to analyze the import structure of Georgia, and on the other hand, try to see how could Georgia enhance its capacity to attract FDI. On this slide, we tried to you see the structure of Georgian imports. Basically, in 2019, we imported around $9 billion worth of products, out of which around $1 billion was destined for re-export. So there's around $8 billion worth of import, which is for Georgian local consumption. And we tried to identify firstly, certain big sectors which are very demanding of import goods. And these are machinery, construction, oil and gas, chemical production, and food products, obviously. And on the other hand, our analysis covered the potential in those industries where we could produce more in order to reduce this import demand. So we identified two big sectors, which is construction and industrial materials, as well as food products, where we in total see around 800 million worth of products that we could manufacture locally. In terms of construction materials, this could only represent 25% of local demand. And if we talk about the agricultural business, this growth should come from enhanced primary production as well as food processing. So we clearly see that there is a clear possibility of reducing somehow our dependence on import, which is very important for the country, as for not only for the local consumption, but this could become in the future products that we could potentially export to the regional countries. As for the FDI, I think what our study shows actually that if Georgia takes a decisive actions currently, we could use all our competitive advantages and act really fast. So basically, throughout the years, we all know that Georgia has accumulated certain number of competitive advantages, such as DCFTA agreement that we signed with a number of countries, which gives us access to more than 2.3 billion markets without customs duties, low taxes, low energy and labor costs, low corruption, favorable business environment, free industrial zones in certain regions of Georgia, and also strategic geographic location. So all this being said, I mean, we try to identify the sectors where we think that there is a huge potential, to attract further FDI. And these sectors are textile and apparel and leather manufacturing. I could say that this sector has been growing quite fast throughout last years, and with certain number of big brand names are produced even in Georgia, such as Montclair, for instance. So we have already certain success stories over here. We have certain companies who are entering the manufacturing and automobile industry in Georgia as well. So there is a kind of know-how as well in the country. There are other sectors such as production of pharmaceuticals and chemicals, manufacturing of home appliances, transport and logistics, and last but not the least, the business process outsourcing, where we have a number of big international companies already outsourcing their business over here. So clearly we have this capacity, and if we act decisively and in a correct manner and in a let's say structured manner, I think we could be quite successful. One of the main setbacks or challenges which we see on this road is that we won't be alone. Basically, what we read and what we analyze, what we understand is that post-COVID world will be quite competitive. Most of emerging markets will be fighting for additional FDI. So the countries which have more, let's say, structured approaches, with much decisive movements, will be successful. So we think that the government, we would like to recommend to the government to come up with a roadmap which would target FDI, and we set certain stages which should be included in this roadmap. We don't think that we need at this stage to invent anything. We should initially start with identifying the successful success stories around the world. We can take Ireland, we can take Serbia, we can take any other country which throughout the years has implemented special programs to attract FDI and just adapt them to Georgian reality and today's reality. Secondly, we should do a profound analysis of sectors of Georgia, understand where we have potential. We've already mentioned some of those potentials on the previous slide. We need to also identify and target companies that we would reach out today, because globally you see the global, we realize that there is a global trend today of shifting supply chain. There are also talks of shifting supply chain out of China. So there are European or US companies interested in shifting their capacities out of China, but also Chinese companies who would like to diversify their capacity, would like to have keep their production capacity in China, but also have one leg outside of the zone in case of difficulty maybe in negotiating with the US or any other European country. So later on, I mean, we need to prepare a very focused investment proposal. This proposal could be could include a wide range of items such as assistance in finding land parcels, bringing all the infrastructure necessary for the factories, also assisting in training the labor force, providing certain specialized grant products. Could even be for special industries, some kind of tax holidays as well on a certain period of time. So there are a variety of incentives that we could provide to this type of big international companies so they could move part of their production locally. And last but not the least, and very important part, is the ambitious and very targeted communication strategy, which in our view should be carried on a very high level of government officials. This should not be left on an agency or even Invest in Georgia or any type of these agencies, which are doing their job, obviously, but today the reality is different. Competition is quite high, and there are a number of countries who are preparing to fight this war for FDI. So I think if we move fast and if we move decisively, Georgia could be a good example of bringing FDI not only for the country, but for the region overall. So in a nutshell, this was what I wanted to tell with my presentation. So I'll be happy to answer any questions. And for further information, you can obviously go to our website and download all our reports. This report, which I mentioned about FDI and import, is in preparation and will be published in coming weeks. So I'll make sure that you all receive the copy of the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Otar. Great overview. And I think it sets great stage for Anthony to make his remarks. Anthony will have his own presentation, and Anthony, are you ready to post it? Yeah, go ahead.
I'll be right ahead. Give me 1 second. Let me just put it. Okay, good morning, everyone. Thanks for this opportunity. And Mamuka, as always, I mean, I really appreciate your very timely interaction with everybody here. So this is a really, we don't have any silver bullet, but I think this is a great occasion to unpack and to see how we can overcome this unexpected, unpleasant turbulence. At the outset, I want to make sure that this is a conference on Georgia, just in case, you know, anybody wondering. So title of this Zoom call is Internal and External Economic Dynamics and Georgia's Response to Pandemic. If you see this headline, this is obviously a get-together for what we can do together. This is not about necessarily what happened. This is about what we can do in terms of really getting through this unexpected turbulence. So my baseline is very much positive and optimistic, because if you think about it, I mean, if you're getting sick, your goal is getting better and stronger. I mean, if you want to die, that's the end of the story. And we don't want to go to that direction. Our direction is, how do we get ourselves stronger? And this time, all together. I mean, this is a really, we're all in this together kind of a scenario, because this pandemic is not just a one country specific pandemic. As unpleasant, unacceptable as it may be, this is a regional, and more importantly, this is a global pandemic. So I call this pandemic, let's say, sea turbulence. You can say coronavirus turbulence or China turbulence and whatever, but we're gonna get through this sea turbulence. And that's basically my sort of the baseline. Now, when we talk about internal, external economic dynamics, I think keyword is very much about resilience. And I think that it's very important for us to know what kind of and how much degree of resilience Georgia has. So just very quickly, for this quick remarks I'm gonna make, I'm gonna just carve out your 7 minutes and 15 seconds, no more than that. So let me try to be concise and precise. At the Heritage Foundation, obviously, as an organization, we pay great attention to Georgia, the country Georgia, and our specific angle is this annual index of economic freedom. The only thing you have to see this slide is that this bar chart, red line bar chart, that's where Georgia stands. So Georgia is not down here along with some strange countries. Georgia is far up there with other like-minded and willing countries. Georgia is a functioning free market democracy. You can argue the degree of it, but Georgia is capable and resilient economy. Now, where Georgia is not really, you know, convenient or comfortable environment, look at the map. This is Europe, obviously, you know, far better than I. Georgia's color is kind of light green, which is really kind of good color. I mean, bright green is much better, but Georgia's direction is towards the west. But see the Georgia, how it's been surrounded. It's been surrounded by other countries that are not really as resilient as Georgia is, perhaps. So look at the color difference. We see some, you know, yellows, a lot of yellows actually, but Georgia is once again, it's a light green. And the light green colors to Baltics and, you know, the kind of conventional European countries. And that's the direction that Georgia wants to go. So I think the direction Georgia has been desiring and making steps towards, that's very positive. And that gives Georgia very good setting in terms of getting through and overcoming this ongoing pandemic. And without getting into all the details, because my fellow speakers already laid out all the necessary and very detailed sort of economic indicators and situation. And I think that's where I want to begin my brief remarks on this Georgia's resilience. This chart shows Georgia's progress in terms of advancing economic freedom, competitiveness, and flexibility efficiency since 1996. As you can see, Georgia's economic freedom has been increasing, not every year, but almost every year if you look at the trend line. So from 96 to 2020, Georgia has been advancing good policies that can promote competitiveness, flexibility, and resilience. I mean, we can talk about how fast and how deep, but you cannot deny the positive trend that Georgia has been charting. And as you can see, I made 3 areas of the sort of the notable period. In this 21st century, I think the global economy is basically confronting 3rd global crisis. The first 2 was, this is around September 11, 2001. That was the first sort of global scale crisis in the 21st century. And the second one, as you may have guessed already, that's the global economic and financial crisis. And the third one is what we are going through now. So basically every 10 years or so, the global economy as a whole, we've been dealing with when we end up, kind of confronting this unexpected turbulence. And as you can see, the Georgia, interestingly, again, the index is not a leading indicator, it's a lagging indicator, meaning we cannot forecast what's gonna really happen out of this crisis. But I think it gives us some pretty good kind of a baseline once again, or a few data points we can sort of think through. The global crisis we had to deal with since September 11, 2001, as you can see, Georgia had to also embrace overall economic slowdown in terms of supply and demand and uncertainty and everything. So the line became a bit flat since that crisis for a number of years. The same thing, but since after the September 11, 2001, Georgia made a huge progress. This is where Georgia had really implemented a lot of good regulatory reforms and other structural reforms. So that's why we see this second initial jump in terms of Georgia's transition. And here, 2008-9 global financial crisis, obviously, again, we see some flat lines and after the aftermath of the global financial economic crisis. And then we are now here. I want to highlight 2 things. One, the general trend line is positive. And as of last year and this year, Georgia kept the momentum of upward slope. This is important. So my prediction is that, well, it's not going to be easy. And the uncertainty caused by this pandemic is given to everyone, every country. You cannot avoid this uncertainty. We have more unknowns than knowns, just borrowing Secretary Rumsfeld's terms. But what's really important is that willingness and baseline resilience. I happen to think that Georgia has pretty good level of resilience. Mercedes, she pointed out, fiscal buffers and other other factors, positive factors, well-capitalized banking sector, and strong donor community interaction. I mean, Georgia has credibility. Georgia has a reputation as a strong emerging economy. And Otar mentioned there are some immediate negative impacts and delayed negative impacts, but Georgia has a lot of neutral, kind of neutralized ongoing developments too. It has a very strong segment of the economy, service and e-commerce and all that. And we can really focus on those things as an immediate next step in terms of revitalizing economic dynamism in Georgia. So this is for everybody. I mean, nobody cannot avoid this uncertainty, but what we can do is mitigate and navigate this risk. There's no uncertainty management, but we can exercise some risk management. And that comes to sort of my final slide, because again, this is a global pandemic. This is a global turbulence. I think this is very important for us to remember. Georgia, United States, we have been working together and we will be working again stronger, because the relationship between Georgia and Washington is not just overnight kind of spontaneous transactional relationship. We've been building this relationship with Georgia, Tbilisi and Washington, DC, not always on the same page, but despite some disagreements, we've been having more agreements over the years. That's why we believe Georgia is a proven ally in fighting global common challenges. To me, this pandemic, this turbulence is really, once again, an opportunity rather than very much, the end of the world crisis. And that's why I was emphasizing, yes, we are sick, but we're going to get better and we're going to get stronger. I mean, that's in a way, the essence of getting through virus. So we will be resilient and we will be working together stronger than ever. And it's also good to note that prior to the pandemic, the current pandemic, CDC here in the United States and Georgia's CDC, they've been working together. So this is not like a completely kind of new setting. They've been trying to exchange some key information, how to handle this kind of potential virus and health crisis. And we are building up this momentum, kind of working together as a team. And again, this cannot be done kind of overnight or spontaneous kind of a transactional relationship based. This is really the continuation of what we've been doing with the Georgia. And this is time to do more. So I think there's a very good chance that we can even, going back to my earlier slide, after this pandemic, it will take some, month, but we may see again, kind of nice upward slope in terms of Georgia's progress. So that's where we are. And once again, I submit my optimism of will because I want to work with you all together. We are here to get through this turbulence, not just, bogged down by this turbulence. So once again, I think it'll take time, but I think we can get through this if we work together. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. Thank you for your optimism. And obviously, you mentioned a very important element that I wanted other speakers to mention, that Georgia was handling this pandemic better than many other countries. And because of the assets that we have created, in addition to qualification and experience of some of the doctors who were in charge of this process, but also because of the assets that the United States invested in Georgia, like Lugar Lab and some other assets. So I think this is a great demonstration. If Georgia has success in this during this pandemic times, I think the U.S. contribution is very significant in this process. Now, I would like to maybe distribute first set of questions to our speakers. First one is for Mercedes, and it's about where you see the risk factors for indebtedness of Georgia going forward. You mentioned the donor money will be coming to Georgia. Georgia will be borrowing money, and under certain scenarios, Georgia may have more than 60% of debt to GDP. So, do you see this as a some kind of stress or debt threat factor for Georgia? Second question is about unemployment. Obviously, Georgia had issues with unemployment, and there is a chart that Galton Taggart did several months ago about showing how many Georgians actually are so-called self-employed, in addition to statistically unemployed portion of Georgian population. If you look at a segment of Georgian population that is employed by private sector on a permanent basis, it's a very small fraction of labor force. So I think private sector jobs and job creation, it has some issues, and it had issues before, and now we obviously have some issues. So Otar, maybe you can elaborate a little bit about that. And Anthony, obviously my favorite question is, where do you see free trade agreement between United States and Georgia going? And if there is an opportunity now to go to this issue and talk and discuss this issue with the US government. So why don't we start with these questions? Technically, we could finish at 11:05, 11:10, but if we have a little bit more to discuss, maybe we'll stay together until 11:15. So, I mean, DC time, 6:15 in Georgia. By the way, I have to mention that Otar is in Georgia and other speakers are in DC area, in different parts of DC. Some of us are in Bethesda and Rockwell, and some of us are in DC in town. So anyways, just a little bit of geography because I'm a geographer by basic education. Go ahead, Mercedes.
Thank you, Mamuka. You definitely raise a very interesting question. So let me start by saying that before the shock, and in 2019, public debt reached 43% of GDP. So the level of public debt will increase with the shock, and definitely will increase also because Georgia has fiscal space and is having financing to be able to deploy a comprehensive fiscal response. As you mentioned, this year the public debt will be above 60%, which is envisaged in the fiscal rule, but also the fiscal rule, our understanding is that it does not apply to years in which the emergency status is declared. So we have public debt going to 63%, and what the authorities have committed to, and is that over the medium term there will be a pace of fiscal consolidation. So, of course, the pace of fiscal consolidation will depend on how the impact and the duration of the shock evolves. But in our discussions with the authorities and under the commitment of our program, they will revert to 45% of GDP over the medium term. So our assessment of the public debt is that the public debt is sustainable and will remain sustainable. You can also think that, you know, for better or worse, Georgia has not been dependent on portfolio flows or very hot money to finance the external balance. So in getting donor assistance, you are able to finance at long-term, relatively low interest rates, and your profile of the debt service is relatively benign. The maturity of the public debt is about 8 years at the moment. And we see that, yes, it will decline, but there is a space to increase the debt. And we thought that this is, if you don't get indebted now to respond to this shock, when are you going to do it? So back to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Otar, please. Irina, please unmute Otar.
Yes. So, Mamuka, my question was regarding the unemployment overall in Georgia, right?
I mean, so, yeah, and the private sector employment in general and under current conditions, where you see things moving. So,
well, it is important. I mean, important to notice first that tourism and the service industry overall employed around 50% of the Georgian population, and it generates around 80% of GDP. So the current crisis is a very big, significant shock for this population who were working in this environments. Also, there's a big part of people who are self-employed, and 80% of self-employed people are in agriculture. And the biggest difficulty which we have currently in Georgia is our agriculture industry is quite is unproductive. Basically, for years we've been discussing about the land reform because most of land parcels in Georgia are very small, which makes it difficult for production, from productivity to be increased. So now the government, throughout the crisis, is starting to accelerate this program. So we're going to have a huge reform on this. Another big issue is that education. That government is working on the education so that the workforce on the market is a match for the demand as well. So our view, and in my presentation I presented, I think we should make a bigger focus on the production capacity growth. We need to take these people who are now working in the agriculture, and they might have a low valued jobs over there, and bring them to the factories and maybe even textile industry. For instance, if you take textile business now in Georgia, which is mostly on the western side of Georgia, Najara and Guria, these companies are labor intensive. So, and we have a huge capacity to increase this business over there, which could enable us to employ much more people over there. There are certain, I mean, even if when we discuss the FDI attraction or the policies where we could bring some certain companies, this is the objective. And one of the biggest benefits that Georgia has, we are a young country with with very low labor force in terms of cost and energy cost as well. So I think all these items make Georgia one of the best places to do business, actually. So I think this is a big problem, but if we move, as I said, decisively and in a very structural manner, we could enable these people to move from certain low-valued industries to much more high-valued, added value businesses for Georgia.
Otar, there's a question from the audience about tourism sector, and I want to ask you this question before we move to Anthony. So the question is about sort of what are the products that Georgia could develop to be more competitive in the current environment. Obviously, you mentioned about domestic tourism, and that will be probably first stage will be focused on domestic stage. But what do you expect in terms of, have you thought or do you know about any kind of special strategy or approach that can be employed in this kind of environment? And in particular, sort of what type of products Georgia should be pursuing going forward?
It's a very interesting and important question. Actually, you correctly mentioned that Georgia has managed, and for many people surprisingly well, handled the epidemics as of today. So as of today, the number of people who got sick with COVID is around 600 people, which is very low compared to even our neighboring countries. So we see today that there is a move of opening up tourism slowly, because we, and from June, we're gonna be able to travel internally. So we're gonna have a local tourists soon. And from July, we're gonna start working with, we will be able to attract foreign tourists. Initially, the government, and we've been working with the government on this, they are trying to set up a secured corridors. For instance, they are trying to work with Israel, which has also managed quite well the pandemics. So there could be, if the negotiations go till the end, some secured corridor with certain countries. Another country which is in discussion is Czech Republic. Actually, one good positioning where Georgia is today is that we have still month and a half or 2 months until we open up our borders, and we already see that Europe is releasing the lockdown. So we see Spain and Italy are starting to flights between each other. So we could monitor the situation, we could monitor how this evolves, and try to adapt accordingly. But I think anyway, this year, I don't expect any big figures in tourism. As I said, the hit will be quite significant, and I think the government is realizing it, and they'll make everything possible to assist this industry to kind of overcome this empty period, because there is nothing you can do when tourism is just afraid. And another very important thing is that to kind of rubber stamp and kind of show to everybody and showcase Georgia as a country which managed very well the pandemic. There's one thing when Georgia says we were a very good student in managing this, and there is another thing when the World Tourism Organization approves that Georgia has been managing very well, and maybe even there was idea of certifying certain countries as a low risk in COVID. So there are many things on the table which needs to be kind of decided. But in any ways, this year is going to be a very difficult year for tourism anyway.
Thank you, Otar. Thank you very much. Anthony, please.
Thank
Your
you,
difficult question to answer.
Thank you, Mamuka. And once again, we cannot control and manage uncertainty. Uncertainty is given to us, imposed on us, but we can manage and navigate and mitigate risk, whether that is the economic risk, political risk, or even policy risk. So that's the variables. Risk variables are the ones we need to handle. Number two, again, I submit our baseline is Georgia is a resilient and capable country. Let's not forget about that, because we're not talking about some fragile country here. Georgia is fundamentally strong and resilient economy. The question is, how do we elevate and notch up the status? So if I may submit one kind of internal policy, since this conference is about internal and external, internally, I think this may be a good time for Georgia to notch up, confidence in government, trust in government, how to handle this lingering institutional problem. I think that's something that Georgians can debate as you try to move and as you try to get stronger. So that kind of homework is very important. Now, concerning your question, let's not forget about this is a very entertaining yet consequential year here in the United States. This is a presidential election year. November 3rd, no matter what, it will be right up there. That obviously presents, again, another level of risk and opportunity. And I happen to think that this is really a show, entertainment we can really watch, but we got to use it wisely. Quite frankly, for the remaining of the year, I don't think we can expect any meaningful discussion concerning US-Georgia FTA. But we do know that there's a willingness, there's a desire between Washington, D.C. and Tbilisi. And that's why I was mentioning number 1, number 2 point, risk management and a few homeworks that Georgia needs to do. So this is not just a mere wait and see kind of period. This is a very much a strategic preparation period. So when we get into 2021, we can talk about a lot more things at an elevated level. I think if we have any meaningful, fast recovery, either political or economic or financial, everything will be most likely happen towards the end of the year and getting into 2021. So our strategic immediate target should be how to prepare ourselves and really take advantage of the newly founded momentum in 2021.
Thank you, Anthony. Very comprehensive and serious answer, definitely. Mercedes, I have another question from our audience here for you. The question is about where do you think commodity trade, what are the prospects of commodity trade going forward? And I assume, obviously, we are all interested, when do you think commodity prices will start to recover? This is a question from our good friend, Alexander Meladze. I think we have Mercedes on mute.
Thank you, Mamuka. Indeed, a very interesting question with a lot of uncertainty. I think, the recovery in commodity prices will depend on two things. How long the shock lasts and how much subdued demand globally we are going to see. And the picture is mixed at the moment. So we have advanced economies still going through significant sharper slowdown in economic activity. We have some measures in oil prices. Of course, we have the measures from OPEC to reduce supply that will kick in the next month. And then we need to think also about how the recovery will look like. Because if we are all, if social distancing is here to stay, and most of us are going to be working remotely for an extended period of time, the way the recovery of economic activity is going to look very different to what we have seen in the past, and that will have an impact in commodity prices. Not only because we will use less. We don't have to commute to the office, we are using less of cars, but also because, investment and the way we are thinking about investment from the public sector or from the private sector may look different. Maybe there is a shift from physical investment to technology investment. So I think it's very uncertain to see. It will depend on how the recovery looks like, and there are many questions about how the new normal will look in the future.
But as I recall, IMF, for its outlook for the next year, you have 5% growth for the next year, total growth, GDP growth for the world, So yes. That probably will require that will drive some recovery, not full recovery.
Yes, and we foresee some recovery. from the growth rates that we are going to see in Q2, Q3, we are going to see recoveries in growth. Whether that recovery in growth is going to be enough to bring us to where we were before the shock and where were we projecting economic activity is a big question. I don't think that will happen over in the short term. I mean, just to mention 2 days ago, managing director Kristalina Georgieva already mentioned that we are updating our outlook for June, and it seems that the global economic activity is lower than what we were thinking at the time where we released our latest World Economic Outlook. If you allow me, I want to mention, I mean, sure. I want to go back to the tourism sector, and I think here the fact that the Georgian authorities have been very proactive in controlling the crisis and managing well the health pressures create also opportunities, as Otar mentioned, and becoming part of the network of green zones or COVID green zones for tourism in the European network could be a good initiative to think about it. I mean, the economic recovery is very uncertain. It will depend on how tourism recover over the medium term, but also how domestic demand is going to recover. So it's a big question. I think in our projections, we are going to see a significant slowdown in economic activity in Q2 and Q3 as a result of the lockdown and a gradual opening of the economy with some growth in Q4. But as I mentioned, it's still very uncertain.
I need to ask you one other question. I think it's, maybe we'll start with you and move to Otar, and if Anthony wants to comment on that as well. But this is a very important question. As we all know, banking sector of Georgia was very resilient always and successful, one of the successful sectors of Georgian economy. So where you see banking sector moving? And I know that there are some donor money actually considered to be channeled through banks that supposed to help banking system. But ultimate goal is obviously to move private sector economy kind of forward. That's, at least from our perspective, that's a major priority. But sort of where do you see banking sector, Mercedes, and then Otar and Anthony, and we'll probably wrap up on that.
So as I mentioned in my speaking points, the financial sector has been able, mostly banks have been able to build significant buffers in liquidity and in capital. So far, we have not seen a significant increase or deterioration in the credit quality. So far, we think that the capital and liquidity buffers that have been released for the banking sector will provide buffers to absorb some of the deterioration that we are going to see in credit quality. As you mentioned, international financial institutions are not only supporting the banks, they are also supporting directly the banking sector. And our estimate is that about 1.5 billion have been mobilized to support the private sector. The big question is how credit quality will sustain in the coming days, in the coming month to the end of the year. And in supporting access to credit and sustain economic activity, what the authorities have put in place is some credit guarantee mechanism that will help the private sector to access credit and to maintain operations. And also some direct support to some of the sectors. Here we go back to see how the recovery will happen. If domestic demand doesn't recover significantly in the coming months, we are going to see probably a deterioration in credit quality. And we will expect, if we take the 2014 shock, and I'm aware here that there is no precedent to the kind of crisis we are seeing now. If we take as precedent 2014 shock or the global financial crisis, we saw a financial sector that was resilient enough to absorb significant losses. All the losses were not there in the first place. But it's a big question mark. In terms of the Another component is the exchange rate and how exchange rate depreciation could impact credit quality. And here we think that the program put in place by the authorities provide enough ammunition to support or to avoid excessive volatility in the exchange rate. Thank you.
Thank you, Mercedes. Ottar, can you please comment as well briefly, if you could?
Yes, of course. Well, it's, I mean, Ms. Martin has already answered quite elaborately on the question based on the condition of Georgian banks. As of today, we see that they are quite resilient. Historically, these institutions have been quite resilient due to buffers and due to regulatory framework, which was set up by National Bank of Georgia. The banks were the first to initiate the holidays for people who had to pay mortgages for 3 years, beginning once the pandemic started. So this additional impact on the society was quite important. I think important thing is that if we compare to other crises like 2008, where the problem came from the financial sector, I think this time is quite different. I mean, this time the banks are quite resilient. The banks have their role to play. I believe that the only way to open up economy and the only way to not get to the crediit crunch for the corporate sector is by providing sufficient liquidity for banks so that they continue disbursing this money to the industry. And I think no one better knows how to fund the economies than just banks, which are already present in the country. So I think the liquidity is key for the banks, so that they can lend in lari, especially because of certain regulations. And on the other hand, I mean, we'll see, as Ms. Martin mentioned, how the economy opens up, how the demand starts to wake up once we go out of the lockdown. So hopefully we won't have the second wave, this mysterious second wave, which could come maybe in the autumn. But if everything goes well and we open up correctly, I think the damage should be limited. And it's very important as well that National Bank has already passed certain big amount of provisions on banks already. So the banks are ready to absorb certain level of shocks, which could be coming down the road, basically. But hopefully this will not get the reality.
Anthony, maybe you can maybe comment a little bit about this subject, but also if you wanted to kind of wrap up on any other subjects that you wanted to maybe conclude this conversation, and then I'll close it. So you'll be the final commentator here today.
Oh, thank you, Mamuka, and I'm honored. But here's my point. Number one, Georgia, once again, is a capable, resilient country. It's a great partner of the United States of America. Number two, we began this whole turbulence with a public health crisis, which has become economic crisis because the pandemic stopped everything, our normal supply, demand, economic activity. This is not yet, at least not yet, full-blown financial crisis. This is not yet, at least not yet, full-blown liquidity crisis. I think this is time to focus on quality rather than quantity. And let's be more strategic. Let's be a bit more measured, because this is not the time we have to fire all the ammunitions. I think we need to take really step by step, a bit more reserved, measured economic stimulus activity. Again, it's only possible because Georgia is a resilient, capable economy. It has those fundamentals in the system. So that's where we are. And once again, this is not really an easy equation we can resolve. But again, how can you avoid your uncertainty? I don't know what's going to happen to me next hour, tomorrow, or next month. But what we can do is really mitigate this existing risk by comparing notes and working together. And I'm delighted to highlight that there's enough willingness, at least from Washington's side, to really make this crisis in a unique opportunity. So I think this is time to be a bit more determined and a bit more like-minded, because we all want to get through this unpleasant turbulence. So let's work on those quality, practical cooperation we can do, and I'm sure we can find a solution to that.
Thank you, Anthony. I think you touched a very important point, quality. And I mean, thinking about tourism, I think probably it will take years for Georgia to come back to the quantities that Georgia received as a tourist from around the world, or in particular neighborhood area. But I think it's time for Georgia to focus more on in this field as well, in quality, in the areas of cultural tourism, wine tourism, and so forth, where value of products could be higher. And while maybe numbers of tourists maybe that'll be relatively less, but money they will spend in Georgia will be exponentially higher. Obviously, that will take lots of effort and time, but I think Georgia is already was already approaching that point, and I think it's time to utilize. But that's one example of how we can move from quantity to quality, among other things. I would like to thank our speakers. I think it was excellent discussion and very high quality discussion. I've learned a lot, and I think it's very helpful to our member companies. I would like to thank members of America-Georgia Business Council, all the sponsors of our conference, and also all the participants who were part of this discussion. Unfortunately, we didn't have live interaction with the audience, but they are here, they are listening, and we would like to thank them for their time. And this presentation will be, this recording of this session will be available on the website of America-Georgia Business Council, and we'll distribute that as well as on Facebook page. So again, thanks to our speakers, Mercedes, Otar, Anthony, and thanks to Irina, who is supporting from Tbilisi, our technical support. And so again, I wish you all good health and stay vigilant. Virus is still around, and we'll see you. Probably we'll announce our next events in next couple of weeks, and hopefully sometime in late June we'll see you again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Mamuka.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye.
Stay safe.
Stay safe.
We'll try.